Hi everyone, this is the first part in a series of 3 videos about the functional anatomy of the central nervous system. In these videos, we will be talking about different parts of the nervous system. We will start with the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, the spinal cord, and then we'll talk about the cerebellum. Now let us first start with basics before we go into details. Now, when there is an aggregation of cell bodies on the nervous system, it is called gray matter. And when part of the nervous system contains axons condensed in a specific site, we call it a white matter. Now there is a general term that is used that when there is a clusters or islands of gray matter surrounded by white matter, these islands are called nuclei when it is found on the central nervous system, and it is called a ganglia when it is found on the peripheral nervous system. So these are common terms that we use on this chapter of the nervous system. Now when axons are going together on the same direction, they form what we call a pathway or tract. Now let us start with the cerebrum, and it's going to be our topic for this video. The outermost layer of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, which is the gray matter. Then we find a layer of white matter, and in the center there is an island of nuclei called the basal ganglia, which we will discuss on our next video. The cerebral cortex has an elevations and depressions on its surface. The elevations are called gyri, while the grooves or the depressions are called sulci. And this helps in increasing the surface area for the cerebral cortex. There are 2 cerebral hemispheres. Now if you are right-handed, then the left hemisphere is your dominant hemisphere. And the dominant hemisphere is associated with logical thinking, writing, language, and it's also associated with positive emotions like excitement and happiness. And the right hemisphere will be your non-dominant hemisphere, and it's associated with imaginary types of thoughts like the music, visual arts, painting, creative thoughts, negative emotions like anxiety, depression, and fear. And this explains why artists tend to develop suicidal thoughts and attempts, because they use the non-dominant hemisphere more frequently. The 2 hemispheres are connected by white fibers called the corpus callosum, and it's a type of commissural fibers. And commissural fibers are the fibers connecting 2 hemispheres. Other type of fibers is called the projection fibers, and these are either ascending fibers to the brain or descending fibers from the brain. Also another type is the association fibers, and these are fibers that connects 2 lobes of the same hemisphere. The brain is covered by 3 layers of connective tissue: an outermost tough dura mater, and a middle arachnoid layer, and an inner layer strongly attached to the cortex called the pia mater. These 3 layers form the meninges, and their function is for protection of the brain and spinal cord from mechanical injury. They also provide the blood supply for the skull and hemisphere in a space called the subarachnoid space, a space between the dura and the arachnoid layer. And it also provides a space for the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid, which we will discuss later on this video. The cerebral hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes by 3 main sulci, and these are the central sulcus, the lateral sulcus, and the parieto-occipital sulcus. So we have 4 lobes and these lobes of the hemisphere will be the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So these are the 4 lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. Now let's look at the functions of each lobe of the cerebral hemisphere, starting with the frontal lobe. This anterior part of the frontal lobe is called the prefrontal cortex, and it's for the higher functions of the brain. And these higher functions like behavior, personality, judgment, mood, paying attention, and planning or thinking about something. On the medial inferior part of the frontal lobe runs the olfactory bulb, which is a part of the first cranial nerve called the olfactory nerve. Then we have this area of the precentral gyrus is called the primary motor cortex for the voluntary control of muscles. And the area near to it is the motor association area for planning and coordination of complex movement. The postcentral gyrus on the parietal lobe is called the primary sensory area, where signals are received from receptors scattered all around the body. And the remaining part of the parietal lobe is the sensory association area. On the occipital lobe, we find the primary visual area, which receives signals from the retina of the eye, and the visual association area, where the image is formed. On the temporal lobe, there is the primary auditory area. It's for hearing, and an association area to make sense out of sounds that is received, and also there is an area for recognition of faces and objects in the temporal lobe. On an inferior view of the cerebrum, we find the area of smell called the ancus, and the remaining part is called the limbic system for the generation of emotions. The fold between the frontal and temporal lobe is where we find the area of taste, and it's called the insula. It's also related to the limbic system, and it has other functions than taste. On the medial part of the temporal lobe, we find the hippocampus, and it's an essential area for memory and learning. Also on the temporal lobe, we have an area called the vernix area. Other names for the vernix area: general interpretative area, or the knowing area, or the gnostic area. And the function of this vernix area, it has something to do with thinking, learning, and making sense out of language, which helps in speech and communication, and reading. Another area that is important for speech is the Broca's area. And this area is for language information, in other words, for speech. Those two areas are essential for communication and speech. In the last segment of this video, we will take a brief look on the ventricular system. Ventricles are the lumen or spaces found inside the cerebrum. Starting with the anatomy, there is a lateral ventricle on each hemisphere. You might call them the first and the second ventricles. Through the foramen of Monro, they empty their contents into the third ventricle, which in turn, through a somewhat narrow lumen called the cerebral aqueduct, empties its content to the fourth ventricle. Then the fourth ventricle is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. There is a type of glial cells which we didn't mention in our introductory video, and it's called the ependymal cells. And these ependymal cells lines the surface of these ventricles. These cells form a structure called the choroid plexus, and the function of these cells is the production of cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is a clear odorless fluid that is found on the subarachnoid space of the cerebrum and the spinal cord. It fills the ventricle and the central canal of the spinal cord. The importance of the cerebrospinal fluid is that the brain floats in it, so it will be able to hold its density without being impaired by weight. The cerebrospinal fluid also acts as a shock absorber for the brain and the spinal cord, and this is called the cushion effect. Cerebrospinal fluid also helps in homeostasis and clearing out waste products from the nervous system, and it is continuous with the venous system of the brain. So guys, that's it for the first part on the anatomy of the central nervous system. In the next part we will have a look on the basal ganglia and the diencephalon. So we meet again on our next video.